It begins with a silence so heavy it almost feels manufactured. A still image, grainy, washed in warped grayscale, flickers onto the screen. The camera angle is low, tilted slightly as if whoever set it up didn't intend for this footage to ever be reviewed. Dust particles drift across the lens like slow-moving static. At first glance, there is nothing unusual about the hallway it captures: peeling wallpaper, emergency exit signs, and a faint hum from old fluorescent bulbs. But then, the screen jumps. A subtle distortion. A ripple that shouldn't exist on analog tape. And for a moment, a shadow cuts across the far end of the corridor, tall, narrow, impossibly still. Authorities would later say that the building had been empty for 15 years. No tenants. No staff. No reason any surveillance equipment should have been running. Yet, this single tape, found inside a room sealed from the outside, shows movement at exactly 3:19 a.m., long after electricity was supposedly shut down. That timestamp is the first crack in a story that refuses to fit inside the boundaries of logic. As investigators played the tape for the first time, the atmosphere in the room shifted. Even hardened officers who had seen the worst human horrors leaned forward, brows furrowed, as if trying to decode something they all sensed but could not articulate. The camera pans slightly, mechanically, like a motion-activated unit, but no official records indicate that the building ever used rotating CCTV systems. It shouldn't have been able to track movement. Yet it did. Slowly. Intentionally. Almost like it was following something just out of frame. Then comes the sound. A faint, rhythmic tapping. Not loud enough to alarm, but consistent enough to feel deliberate. It echoes through the hallway in a pattern: 3 slow taps, a pause, then 2 quick ones. Officers assumed it must have been pipes contracting, or some small animal trapped behind the walls. But as the pattern repeated, perfect in timing, it resembled something disturbingly close to communication. And still, nothing visible moves. The distortion returns, this time more violent. The picture bends, drags downward, and then snaps back into clarity. When the image stabilizes, the shadow at the end of the corridor is closer. Not by a step. Not by gradual approach. But by a sudden shift in location, like missing frames between breaths. And the figure, if it is a figure, doesn't resemble a person. It is too elongated, neck too thin, body slightly curved as if gravity behaves differently for it. Investigators froze the frame. Enhanced it. Zoomed in. But the more they analyzed, the less human the shape became. It lacked definition. No facial features. No discernible clothing. Just a silhouette absorbing more light than it reflects. A void pretending to have a form. And while they examined it, the tapping grew louder, syncing with the irregular static crawling along the bottom of the screen. Then, without warning, the light in the hallway bursts. Not explodes, bursts, as if consumed from within. Darkness overtakes the frame for 4 seconds. For long, suffocating seconds where every investigator in the room holds their breath, waiting for what will emerge when the camera's auto-adjust finally compensates. When the picture returns, the hallway is empty. Silent. Motionless. The shadow is gone. The tapping stops. But something else appears, just barely, in the bottom corner of the frame, a reflection in the dusty floor tiles. Something overhead. Something leaning close to the camera's blind spot. Something that shouldn't be able to cast any reflection at all. This final detail is what forced authorities into action. Within hours of reviewing the footage, local officials arrived on site. Hazmat suits. Barricades. Metal plates welded across entrances. Neighbors who witnessed it said the operation looked more like a quarantine than an investigation. By sunrise, the building was sealed completely, every exit bolted, every window reinforced, every record quietly classified. None of that, however, compares to the most disturbing fact revealed later: this particular camera, the one capturing the shadow, the movement, the reflection, was verified to have been disconnected from its power source since 2007. Yet this footage was recorded in 2019. And the tape itself? It was never meant to exist. The building did not always carry the weight of dread that clings to it now. Once, decades ago, it stood as a symbol of renewal, a community center meant to breathe life into a neighborhood struggling against economic decay. Families gathered there for weekend events, children played in its once bright hallways, and the old auditorium echoed with music, laughter, and folding chairs scraping across the floor. People remembered it as a place of light, warmth, routine. But buildings often absorb more than sound, they absorb stories, secrets, and everything that festers in the corners where no one bothers to look. The transformation began slowly. After funding cuts and staff shortages, the community center was sold to a private contractor working with local authorities. Officially, it was repurposed for municipal storage, though no one was ever quite sure what exactly was being stored inside. Trucks arrived at night. Workers unloaded crates with no labels, always escorted by uniformed guards who didn't speak much and rarely made eye contact. The cheerful posters on the walls faded, replaced with peeling paint and silence. Within 5 years, the building felt like a husk of its former self, occupied, yet utterly lifeless. Residents living nearby started reporting strange incidents. Some heard machinery running late into the night, even though the building's electric bills showed almost no consumption. Others insisted they saw silhouettes behind upper-floor windows, long after the supposed staff had left. One elderly man claimed he heard someone whispering his name from the alley beside the back entrance, but when he turned, there was no one there, not even footprints in the recent rain puddles. These accounts were dismissed as exaggerations, effects of a declining neighborhood. But patterns, even ignored ones, tend to resurface. The first documented accident occurred when a janitor, working a temporary shift, fell down the service stairwell. He survived, though severely injured, and his statement only deepened the growing unease. He insisted he had seen a second figure descending the stairs beside him, though security logs confirmed he was alone. He described the figure as thin, too thin, like it was stretched. When asked if perhaps it was a trick of the light, he became agitated, repeating that the figure moved without sound. His employment was terminated quietly soon after, and the incident was buried under routine paperwork. More unusual events followed. A contractor inspecting the basement reported hearing metal scraping behind a locked door, one no one had a key for. During a routine fire drill inspection, an officer noted rooms in the blueprints that did not exist physically, as if the structure had been altered and re-altered without documentation. And always, the same description surfaced: long shadows, shifting shapes, movement at the edge of vision. Yet nothing ever appeared on the official cameras. No visual proof. No undeniable evidence. Just testimonies from people who swore they had seen something watching them. Perhaps the most unsettling account came from a young clerk named Miriam, who worked briefly at the building's front desk before abruptly quitting. She later told a friend that while she was sorting through old personnel files, she kept noticing one particular name, Ernest Weller, scrawled in margins, circled in red, or highlighted as active duty, even during years in which the building was supposedly vacant overnight. She claimed some pages looked rewritten, as if someone had attempted to erase and rewrite history inside those metal cabinets. Miriam never returned to pick up her final paycheck. Eventually, funding for the facility dried up completely. The official narrative was that the structure was obsolete, too costly to maintain. But residents recall something different. They remember a fire truck parked outside for hours one night without its sirens, men in suits carrying briefcases into the building at dawn, and the day every window was suddenly boarded shut. By the time the closure was announced, the building had already been deserted for months. But deserted does not always mean empty. When nature began reclaiming the structure, ivy crawling through cracks, rain dripping through the roof, feral cats weaving through broken tiles, the building's presence changed again. It no longer felt abandoned. It felt dormant. Waiting. Those who walked past it described a heaviness in the air, a coldness that didn't match the weather. Some swore they heard footsteps echoing inside when the wind was still. Others claimed the emergency exit signs glowed faintly at night, even though the building had no electricity. Among the scattered records that survived, there is one final entry logged by an unidentified employee: "We should not leave it alone. Something here remembers us." No signature. No timestamp. Just that single line, like a warning scribbled moments before someone walked away forever. But one man did not walk away. One man insisted the rumors were true, that the building wasn't empty. Even after staff left, contractors stopped coming, and authorities locked the last door, he claimed he still heard voices echoing in the hallways, voices calling his name specifically. That man was Ernest Weller. And the more the building fell into silence, the more Ernest believed something inside refused to let go of the people who once worked there. Most dismissed him as paranoid. But years later, when the old security tapes resurfaced, many would look back at Ernest's warnings and realize he might have been the only one who truly understood what lived between those crumbling walls, or what never left. Before the building slipped into its long stretch of abandonment, there was one man who walked its empty corridors long after everyone else had left. His name was Ernest Weller, a quiet, soft-spoken night shift security guard in his late 50s. He was the kind of person most would overlook: stooped shoulders, worn-out boots, and a face that always carried the tired gentleness of someone who spent his whole life doing thankless jobs. But the people who knew Ernest, even briefly, would tell you the same thing: he was loyal, honest, and devoted to routines. It was these exact traits that made what happened to him so deeply unsettling. Ernest took the night shift because he preferred silence. He liked the stillness of late hours, the predictable echo of his footsteps, the comfort of knowing he was the only one awake within a building full of locked rooms. He described his shift as peaceful, even calming, until the year everything changed. According to old logbooks, the first sign came in the form of minor irregularities: doors that wouldn't stay locked, lights flickering even after maintenance crews replaced the fixtures, and faint sounds of shuffling from floors that hadn't been used in years. At first, Ernest rationalized it all. Old buildings creak. Pipes expand and contract. Wind travels strangely through long corridors. He knew these explanations by heart, repeating them every time he felt a prickle of unease crawl up the back of his neck. But by the third month, the explanations no longer held. He wrote in one of his early reports: "Noise from the second floor. Sounds like someone pacing. Checked all rooms, empty. Lock on storage door bent. Don't know how." His supervisors dismissed it as vandalism or local teens sneaking in, though no forced entry was ever found. They told him to write the anomalies down and keep moving. Ernest did exactly that. Every night, his entries grew longer, more descriptive, more desperate to find logic where there was none. One note read: "Heard a whisper, very close. Thought someone was behind me. Turned around, nobody." Another said: "Saw shadow under the door of room 214. Opened door. Shadow gone." The most disturbing report came from an incident Ernest never verbally shared. It only exists in writing, torn slightly at the edges as if hastily handled. He wrote: "Heard humming in the basement hallway. Deep male voice. Followed sound. Lights flickered. When they came back, humming was right behind me. Felt breath on my neck." Ernest rarely exaggerated, and his choice of detail, "felt breath," suggested a level of physical proximity impossible to dismiss as imagination. Despite the fear creeping into his nights, Ernest refused to quit. He believed the building was his responsibility, that he had to see his job through to the end. But what he didn't realize was that the building was also watching him, learning him, recognizing the patterns of his footsteps, the timing of his rounds. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, something inside began responding to his presence. Co-workers noticed a change in him during his final weeks on duty. Ernest became quieter than usual, withdrawn, his eyes sinking deeper into tired sockets. He complained of vivid dreams that felt more like memories, scenes of walking down hallways he didn't recognize, hearing someone call his name from far away. He'd sometimes pause mid-sentence, staring into empty space as if trying to listen to something no one else could hear. His niece, the only family he spoke to regularly, later recounted how Ernest once mentioned seeing people inside the building, figures standing at the end of hallways, not moving, not blinking. When she asked who they were, he simply replied, "Not who. What?" He offered no further explanation. As his paranoia grew, Ernest started carrying a small tape recorder during his rounds. He recorded footsteps he claimed didn't match his pace, disembodied voices too faint to identify, and strange metallic scraping sounds. Most of the recordings are lost, except one. In that surviving clip, you can hear Ernest breathing heavily, whispering to himself, "It's following me again." Then a long silence. Then the sound of something dragging across the floor, slow, deliberate, impossibly close. By the time the building was set to shut down permanently, Ernest seemed almost relieved. This place had drained him mentally, spiritually, and physically. He took comfort in believing the structure would finally be emptied, locked, and left behind. But the night of his final shift proved that nothing inside wanted him to leave so easily. His last written report, logged at 2:10 a.m., reads as follows: unusual movement on south wing camera. Thought building power was off for shutdown, but monitor flickered on. Saw something on screen, tall distortion at end of hall. Went to check, but corridor empty. Lights humming louder tonight. Feeling watched. 7 minutes later, he began what would become his final entry. The handwriting starts steady, then trembles, then abruptly stops mid-sentence, hearing it again. Behind me this time. If anyone finds this, tell them, nothing more. No signature. No timestamp. No explanation of what he wanted to warn others about. When staff arrived the next morning, Ernest was gone. His uniform jacket lay folded neatly on the security desk. His flashlight was found rolling slowly on the floor, as if recently dropped. But Ernest himself was never seen again, not in the building, not anywhere else. No forced entry. No sign of struggle. No trail to follow. Authorities concluded he must have left his post, a phrase that angered those who knew him. Ernest would never abandon a duty he cared so deeply about. Something happened to him inside that building, something his final, unfinished words suggest he understood too late. Now, with the discovery of the old security tapes, investigators are beginning to wonder if the footage holds the missing pieces of Ernest Weller's last moments. And worse, whether he was truly alone during those final minutes. Years after Ernest's disappearance and the building's eventual abandonment, the structure stood untouched, its windows blackened with grime, its hallways rotting in silence. Time had tried to erase its story, burying it beneath layers of dust and peeling paint, but history has a way of resurfacing when least expected. In this case, it happened during a routine city redevelopment project. A construction crew had been assigned to inspect old municipal properties slated for demolition. Most expected nothing more than mold, asbestos, and structural decay. But the moment they stepped inside the building, the air grew heavier, thick, unmoving, as though the walls themselves resisted disturbance. The crew complained of an odd stillness, of how their footsteps sounded too loud, too intrusive. Flashlights flickered inexplicably, tools malfunctioned, and one worker refused to continue after claiming he saw a figure standing at the far end of a hallway, despite being assured no one else had entered the building. Their foreman dismissed the unease as nerves. They had a job to do. And part of that job was clearing out the old security office on the ground floor. The room was cluttered with rusted filing cabinets, broken monitors, and coils of wires that looked fossilized in dust. It was there, hidden behind a toppled shelving unit, that they found a metal storage cabinet bolted shut. The cabinet was so corroded that its edges had fused into the frame. Using crowbars and a portable saw, the workers pried it open, expecting old paperwork or outdated electronics. Instead, they discovered a stack of VHS tapes, each one unlabeled except for a date written in fading marker ink. The dates ranged from 1994 to 2019, years during which the building had no official occupancy, no running power, and no active surveillance systems. The foreman's first instinct was to contact city records. Old media found in abandoned government buildings usually held no real value. But the moment he mentioned that the tapes were stored in a sealed, unregistered cabinet, something changed. Within hours, unmarked vehicles arrived at the site. Men in dark jackets stepped out, flashing temporary authorization badges that the construction crew had never seen before. They said very little, only that the contents of the cabinet were now classified and would be transported immediately for municipal review. Workers watched as the tapes were loaded into thick evidence bags. No one offered explanations. No one asked for statements. And no one acknowledged the strange detail that lingered in every construction worker's mind: why would a forgotten building contain surveillance tapes from years when its power grid had been disconnected? What happened next came from the account of a single whistleblower, a junior archivist assigned to catalog historical municipal media. He spoke anonymously to an investigative reporter months after the building was sealed. According to him, the tapes were brought to a restricted media lab for restoration. The archivist expected degradation, mold, static, normal symptoms of age. But what he discovered was far from normal. The footage on the tapes was inexplicably clear. Too clear. There were distortions, yes, but not the kind caused by magnetic decay. These distortions looked organic. Like something moving across the lens, as though the camera wasn't malfunctioning, but reacting. The archivist recalled that during playback, he felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise, even before anything unusual appeared on screen. On one of the earliest tapes, dated for a night in 2004, longer after lights had been shut off permanently, the camera captured an empty corridor vibrating faintly, as if the air itself was trembling. On another, shadows stretched unnaturally along the walls, extending and retracting without any identifiable source of light. The archivist became convinced the tapes were never meant to be found, especially when he noticed a disturbing inconsistency: the timestamps didn't align with any known electrical logs. In fact, several tapes displayed activity during nights when city records confirmed the building had been physically locked and its circuit breakers removed. When he raised questions to his supervisor, he was told to stop reviewing the footage immediately. Hours later, the lab was visited by the same officials who had retrieved the tapes. Orders were given to relocate the recordings to an off-site facility. No documentation accompanied the transfer, not even a standard chain of custody form. But the archivist knew what he saw. On one tape, recorded in 2012, years after the building fell into total disuse, a figure appeared in the frame. At the far end of a poorly lit hallway, something humanoid stood beside a door marked "Authorized Personnel Only." It didn't move. It didn't sway or breathe. But its presence warped the air around it, bending the edges of the frame. After 5 seconds, the figure vanished, not by walking away, but by flickering out, like a glitch erasing itself. The archivist described it in a trembling whisper: it wasn't a person. The camera reacted like it was something the lens didn't know how to process. Like it wasn't meant to be seen. This revelation spread quickly among the internal team. Curiosity turned to dread when they discovered the most baffling detail of all: the tape that showed the figure was recorded during a citywide blackout. There should have been no electricity to power cameras, no functioning security system, no equipment capable of capturing footage. This anomaly alone should have prompted a full investigation, but instead, the response was swift and secretive. The recordings were officially classified. The building was ordered sealed. All public records regarding its occupancy, maintenance, or security logs were quietly amended or removed. Somewhere during this flurry of containment, one detail leaked: an internal memo claimed the contents of the tapes displayed activity beyond normal structural or environmental anomalies. The memo ended with a line the archivist never forgot: "Whatever is present inside the building demonstrates autonomous movement inconsistent with human or animal behavior." No further explanation was offered. No official report followed. But the fact remains: the old security tapes were never supposed to exist, much less capture something moving freely in a building long abandoned, in a hallway long forgotten, under conditions that defy every rule of logic. And yet, they did. The decision to view the tapes was not made lightly. Even the officials assigned to examine them hesitated, sensing something unusually wrong in the way the recordings had been handled. But curiosity, responsibility, and a growing undertone of fear eventually compelled them to gather in a dim archival room equipped with an old VHS playback system. The hum of the machine filled the silence as the first tape slid into place, its black plastic casing still cold as though it had been stored in a freezer rather than a forgotten cabinet. The screen flickered. For a moment, only static danced across it, white noise crackling like distant rain. Then, gradually, shapes began to form. The outline of a corridor emerged, captured in low-resolution grayscale. The camera seemed fixed at an angle slightly downward, as if trying to catch something that moved closer to the floor than a human would. Dust drifted lazily in the air, illuminated by a faint overhead light that should not have been functioning. At first, there was nothing unusual. Just silence, stillness, and the faint electrical buzz of ancient equipment forced back to life. But something about the image felt wrong. The lighting was inconsistent, shadows stretched in directions that didn't match the placement of the bulbs. The walls appeared to pulse subtly, as if the frame was breathing. And the motion sensor indicator on the corner of the screen flickered on and off, responding to something unseen. The investigators leaned forward when the first anomaly appeared. A grainy, elongated silhouette materialized at the far end of the hallway. It wasn't walking or approaching. It simply existed, one frame empty, the next frame containing the shape. No transition. No movement. Just a sudden intrusion into the visual space. The figure stood too still, too rigid, its outline bent as if molded incorrectly. It resembled a person only in the loosest sense: 2 legs, a torso, a head, but its proportions were all subtly distorted. As the playback continued, the camera jerked slightly to the left. At first, the team assumed it was the machine malfunctioning. But the motion had a peculiar deliberateness to it, almost as if the camera was following something. The movement was smooth, steady, and uncharacteristic of autonomous CCTV units from that era. The room watching the playback fell into total silence. Then the hallway lights flickered. The shadows mutated, lengthening, folding, rippling across the floor like ink spreading through water. The silhouette at the end of the hall vanished, and a soft, rhythmic tapping echoed faintly from the speakers. 3 taps. A pause. 2 taps. The same pattern Ernest had once reported years earlier. This connection made one of the investigators mutter under their breath, "That can't be a coincidence." As they watched, the tapping grew louder, sharper. The overhead bulbs flickered again, and for a heartbeat the entire screen went black. When the picture returned, the camera angle had shifted slightly further down the hall, even though the film was uncut. It was as though the tape had captured missing seconds, time that existed but hadn't recorded properly. The figure returned. Closer this time. Not walking, merely appearing. It stood only a few feet from the camera now, but its details remained obscure. Its face, or what should have been a face, was an indistinct blur, like smeared charcoal. The investigators paused the tape, navigating frame by frame, hoping to capture a clearer image. But the more they tried to focus, the more the form distorted. It seemed to reject clarity, dissolving into static whenever sharpened. One investigator whispered, "It's not a technical glitch. It's deliberate." He didn't mean the tape. He meant whatever was being recorded. The motion sensor indicator glowed a bright red. The air on the screen shimmered, bending light unnaturally around the figure. And then, slowly, the silhouette leaned forward, its upper body tilting at an impossible angle as though boneless. A low vibration crackled through the speakers, something like a distant growl layered beneath static. Someone reached for the stop button, but the screen changed before they could press it. The camera zoomed in. No mechanical noise. No motor whirring. Just a sudden, unnatural close-up of the figure's head. The distortion warped violently, lines tearing across the screen. The image snapped again. Now the camera showed only the empty hallway. But the investigators knew the figure had not walked away. It had vanished mid-frame, defying every logic of recorded movement. While they processed this, another anomaly appeared. On the dusty floor tiles beneath the camera's view, a faint reflection shimmered, something hovering just outside the camera's direct line of sight. Its shape moved even though nothing was visible above it. A shadow without a source. A form reacting to a presence no lens could capture. The investigator nearest the screen leaned closer, squinting. His voice broke the silence. Freeze it. Frame 742, zoom in. The technician complied. The screen sharpened. Slowly, the reflection on the ground defined itself, a thin, elongated limb bending at an angle no human joint could replicate. A second limb followed. And then, faintly, the outline of a face emerged in the reflection. But it was not Ernest's, nor any known staff members. The distorted, hollow features hinted at something trying to imitate a human but failing in every unsettling way. The technician stepped back instinctively. That's not human. The room went still. The investigators exchanged glances filled with fear none of them wanted to acknowledge. The implications of the footage were overwhelming. Something had been moving through the building long after it should have been deserted. Something that seemed aware of the cameras, aware of being observed, and capable of manipulating both light and presence. Before shutting the tape off, one final moment froze them all. As the camera panned once more, smoothly, intelligently, a faint whisper crackled through the speakers. Not static. Not distortion. A voice. Low, strained, almost pleading. It said a single word. Stay. No one spoke after the sound faded. No one dared to. Each of them understood that whatever had been recorded inside that building wasn't simply an anomaly. It wasn't a glitch, a trick of the light, or a malfunction. It was something that wanted to be seen, something that had been waiting in the dark hallways, something that had followed Ernest and perhaps others before him. And now, through the old tapes, it had followed them too. The more investigators dug into the building's past, the more they realized that the tapes were only one part of a much larger and far more disturbing puzzle. The next logical step was to cross-reference the dates on the tapes with official employment records, security logs, and municipal files. But the moment they accessed the archives, they encountered a problem no one had anticipated: entire sections of staff documentation were missing. Not misplaced. Not misfiled. Completely gone. As if torn out intentionally. The remaining folders looked inconsistent, years with only one or two documented employees, despite tax records proving the building operated with a full nighttime staff. Pages ended in mid-sentences, signatures cut off, shifts logged by individuals whose names didn't appear anywhere else in the system. It was clear the building had a much longer, more complicated history of personnel than authorities had publicly admitted. And somewhere within that strange gap existed a pattern, one that pointed directly back to Ernest. One investigator, a detail-oriented analyst named Sarah, noticed something unusual: certain years had an abnormally high turnover rate for night workers. Yet there were no termination forms, no resignation letters, and, most importantly, no exit interviews. Employees simply disappeared from the records as though erased. Sarah began compiling a list of names from scraps of paperwork, faded ID card scans, and handwritten memos. The deeper she went, the more sickening the truth became. Almost every missing file belonged to someone involved with the building's night operations. Nighttime custodians. Overnight clerks. Maintenance workers. Temporary contractors. Security personnel. People who worked the same shift Ernest once patrolled alone. Sarah attempted to contact family members of several missing employees, expecting to find people who had moved away or changed jobs without updating records. But the families she reached told stories that were anything but normal. One woman broke into tears when she learned investigators were looking into the building again. She said her brother had worked the night shift there for only 6 weeks before he stopped coming home. When the family reported him missing, authorities claimed he had walked off the job and provided no further help. Another family described how their father, a man with no history of mental illness, began having nightmares during the weeks leading up to his disappearance. He told them he felt something following him inside the building. Something that mimicked footsteps behind him even when he was alone. On the night he vanished, his car was found parked outside the staff entrance, the driver's door wide open. But he had left no note, no belongings, nothing to suggest where he had gone. He was simply gone, absorbed into the building's growing list of unanswered disappearances. A third relative, a nephew of a former custodian, reluctantly shared that his uncle had mailed a letter shortly before his disappearance. The letter mentioned shadows that move wrong, and faces you don't recognize even when they're looking directly at you. The family dismissed these as the ramblings of a man exhausted from night work. But after learning about the tapes, they admitted those words now felt like chilling warnings. As investigators compiled these testimonies, one detail became impossible to ignore: every missing person had worked during the hours the cameras inexplicably recorded activity. And all of them had reported unusual occurrences similar to Ernest's experiences: hallway voices, shifting shadows, cold drafts without explanation, lights flickering in patterns rather than randomly. But one case stood out. A man named Lyle Carter, who worked the building during the same decade as Ernest. His personnel file, unlike the others, was not missing entirely, only heavily edited. Pages were ripped out. His employee photo had been removed, leaving only the faint outline of tape residue. But in the margins of one surviving document, his name appeared repeatedly, underlined and circled, along with a handwritten note: "Night anomalies increased." Carter reported seeing double of himself in reflection. This detail disturbed investigators deeply. Seeing a double suggested something far more sinister, an entity capable not just of mimicking human shape, but of imitating individuals directly. A mimic, or worse, something learning to replace. As Sarah compared the dates of Carter's last logged shift with the anomalies on the tapes, her blood ran cold. One of the unexplained figures caught during a blackout appeared around the time Carter vanished. Its posture. Its proportions. Even its limp, mirroring an injury Carter had suffered weeks before disappearing. The implications were horrifying. Meanwhile, Ernest's name surfaced repeatedly in the scattered documents. In one shattered file folder, investigators found a half-burned memo describing Ernest as observant, increasingly anxious, and reporting activity beyond normal environmental causes. Another memo stated bluntly, "Weller believes the building is responding to him. His reports are becoming too detailed. Might need reassignment." But the strangest discovery came from a relative of Ernest, who reached out after hearing about the renewed investigation. They revealed that Ernest had mailed them something, in case anything happened to him. For years, they assumed it was sentimental, maybe a keepsake or some personal notes. But after learning about the tapes, they decided it might be important. Inside a small envelope, sealed with brittle tape, was a folded sheet of paper covered in scribbled notes and a hand-drawn floor plan of the building. On it were markings indicating areas Ernest believed were unsafe, active, or changing. But most disturbing of all was a phrase repeated over and over in the margins: "It takes shapes. It learns. It remembers voices." This revelation sent investigators into uneasy silence. If Ernest believed the building contained something capable of memory, something capable of imitation, then the old footage showing figures appearing without transition suddenly made far more sense. It wasn't just watching people. It was studying them. Replicating them. Waiting. And if Ernest had mailed this warning before disappearing, then he must have known something was coming for him. One investigator finally broke the silence after reviewing the envelope's contents. "There's a pattern here," he said quietly. "People didn't just go missing. They were replaced. Or something tried to replace them." No one disagreed. Because the more they uncovered, the more obvious it became, the missing files weren't lost. They were removed. Erased. Not to protect the workers, but to hide the thing that had been hunting them. And somewhere within Ernest's hidden envelope lay the first real clue to understanding what the tapes had captured, and what had been stalking the building long before the cameras ever recorded it. The envelope Ernest left behind was small, no larger than a postcard, and sealed with yellowing tape that had cracked along the edges. It looked harmless, even insignificant. But when investigators carefully peeled it open, they realized it held the most important clues yet. Inside was a folded map of the building, a short stack of notes written in Ernest's shaky handwriting, and a single VHS tape labeled in black marker, "Do not watch alone." The map was the first item they examined. It wasn't an official floor plan, this was Ernest's own creation, hand-drawn in thin pencil strokes, lines pressed too hard as if sketched during moments of anxiety. Rooms were labeled not by their intended purpose but by Ernest's personal experiences. Some areas were marked with words like cold, voices, movement, and avoid. A few rooms were circled repeatedly, their borders darkened by dozens of overlapping strokes. One of these heavily circled areas corresponded to a part of the building investigators had already identified as problematic, the sub-basement corridor where the original tapes showed anomalies. But there was something else, something far stranger. Ernest had drawn a small rectangular shape near the bottom corner of the map, labeled simply, "Room that wasn't there before." Investigators exchanged uneasy glances. This aligned with testimonies from staff who claimed the building seemed to shift, to change. But Ernest's depiction suggested he had actually seen such changes firsthand, rooms appearing where none existed before, sections of hallways elongating, doors shifting location overnight. The notes attached to the map painted an even more disturbing picture. Ernest wrote in fragmented sentences, revealing a man who had begun losing trust in his own perception. One note read, "Saw someone on 3rd floor tonight. Looked like Carter, but Carter hasn't worked here in years. He didn't speak. He just stared." Another read, "Something follows the lights. Moves when they flicker. Don't let them go completely dark." The handwriting worsened with each page. The letters grew uneven, slanted, trembling. Ernest seemed desperate to document his experiences even as they overwhelmed him. On one page, nearly every line began with, "It knows me. It knows my route. It knows when I'm alone." But the final note in the stack was the one that left investigators speechless, "It's learning to speak. Heard my name in my own voice." Whatever Ernest had encountered, it wasn't just watching him. It was studying him, mimicking him. And that meant the entity had grown more intelligent over time. Then came the tape. The one labeled, "Do not watch alone." Inside the investigation room, silence settled like a weight. Even the most experienced officers felt a collective hesitation. But protocol required a full review of evidence, so they dimmed the lights, inserted the tape into the machine, and pressed play. This footage was different from the earlier tapes. It wasn't recorded by an automated security camera. The handheld shakiness indicated Ernest himself had filmed it, likely during his final weeks working in the building. The image sputtered to life, showing Ernest's reflection in a small restroom mirror. He looked exhausted, pale, unshaven, eyes wide with paranoia. He spoke directly to the camera in a trembling whisper, "If anyone sees this, something's wrong in this place. I can't explain it. It's not natural." His voice cracked. He looked over his shoulder even though the restroom door was closed. "I hear it every night. It talks sometimes. It tries to sound like me. The camera jerked as Ernest flinched at a noise from somewhere outside the restroom. He held the lens close to his face, whispering, "I think it wants to come out of wherever it's trapped." Then the tape cut to a new scene, Ernest walking down a dim hallway lit only by emergency lights. His breathing was fast, uneven. The camera caught glimpses of walls vibrating slightly, as if reacting to something unseen. A few seconds later, Ernest stopped abruptly and aimed the camera at a reflective floor tile. "There," he whispered. "It doesn't show up right. Watch." The reflection in the tile revealed Ernest standing alone, but beside him, faint, like a smudged shadow, was another figure. Its head tilted toward him, mirroring his posture but lagging behind by a fraction of a second. When Ernest lifted his arm, the figure lifted its own, late again, its movement unnatural and stretched. "It copies me wrong," Ernest whispered. "Like it's practicing." The tape jumped again, another hard cut, as if Ernest had tried to edit something out but failed. Now he stood in front of the sealed basement hallway, the same one that appeared repeatedly in the security tapes. His voice shook as he spoke, "I think this is where it lives." He reached for the handle. The moment he touched it, the camera captured a sudden burst of static, accompanied by a sharp metallic clang, something hitting the other side of the door. Ernest stumbled back, nearly dropping the camera. Then came the most chilling moment of the tape. From behind the door, a voice called out, "Ernest." The voice was unmistakable. It was Ernest's own. Perfectly replicated. He froze. The fear on his face was raw, primal. After a long pause, he whispered, "That's not me." The door rattled. The overhead light flickered violently. Ernest backed away slowly, still holding the camera, breathing hard. But the tape wasn't over. The final segment showed Ernest in the security office, sitting at the desk with the camera pointed at him. The room behind him was dark except for a single emergency light flickering in rhythmic pulses. Ernest whispered, "If this tape is found, don't let them reopen this place. Don't let anyone in." As he spoke, his shadow on the wall behind him twisted, elongating, bending unnaturally, forming a stretched outline that didn't match his movements. Ernest didn't seem to notice. Then, slowly, the shadow's head turned toward the camera. Not Ernest. Not human. Observing. The tape ended abruptly. Investigators sat frozen in place, unable to deny the implications. Whatever Ernest had encountered wasn't just a presence. It wasn't harmless. It wasn't passive. It was something that could learn, that could imitate, that could reach out through walls, reflections, and even voices. And worse, this tape wasn't just a record of Ernest's fear. It was evidence that the entity had been trying to communicate. Trying to escape. Trying to become him. The final, unspoken question hung heavy in the room: if the entity could imitate Ernest's voice so perfectly, what else could it imitate? The deeper investigators ventured into the building's archived layouts, the more the structure itself began to present a mystery far older and darker than the tapes. Official blueprints from the 1970s showed 3 floors and a basement. Updated blueprints from the 1990s showed only slight modifications, storage space expanded, office rooms repurposed. But when investigators compared these documents with Ernest's hand-drawn map, they found something unnerving: rooms Ernest documented did not appear in any architectural record. At first, they assumed Ernest must have been mistaken. Stress can distort memory. Fear can warp perception. But then they examined floor-by-floor schematics and noticed several architectural inconsistencies: hallway lengths that didn't match exterior measurements, missing square footage, sealed doorframes plastered over and painted to appear as seamless walls. The building wasn't just old, it was changed. Altered. Modified in ways no contractor had ever reported. One room in particular stood out. Ernest marked it on his map with a dark box and circled it repeatedly, labeling it simply, "It's here." According to the official plans, there was no room at that location. Just solid foundation. But Ernest had drawn specific notes around it: humming here, cold, voices behind wall, door used to be here. Intrigued and increasingly disturbed, investigators went into the building themselves to verify whether an unexplained space actually existed. They descended into the basement, guided only by dim portable lamps and the echo of their footsteps. The air grew colder the farther they walked, not in a natural draft-like way, but in a sudden, heavy drop that felt more like stepping across a threshold. Several investigators described the sensation as walking into a refrigerator, though there were no vents, no open windows, and no airflow. When they reached the location Ernest had marked, they froze. A section of the basement wall appeared newer than the surrounding structure. The concrete was smoother, less cracked, almost unnaturally uniform. It was as if someone had sealed an opening deliberately, and recently. The edges of the wall didn't match the older construction around it. This wasn't a decades-old barrier. This was something placed after Ernest disappeared. One investigator tapped on the surface. Hollow. Another placed a thermal sensor against it. A faint but irregular heat signature pulsed behind the wall, too rhythmic to be structural settling, too localized to be pipes. Something behind the divide emitted heat in slow, uneven bursts, like breathing. Then came the sound. A soft, barely audible tapping. 3 slow taps, a pause, 2 quicker ones. The same pattern recorded on the tapes. The same pattern Ernest had written about repeatedly. The investigators stepped back instinctively. Someone asked if the noise could be construction debris shifting. Another suggested rats. But no one genuinely believed it. The taps were too deliberate, too precise, echoing the same rhythmic pattern across decades of anomalies. To gather more data, they set up portable monitors around the sealed wall, EMF readers, pressure sensors, and a modern high-definition camera. Almost immediately, the EMF reader spiked. The numbers fluctuated erratically, rising and falling like waves. A seasoned engineer on the team frowned. "This isn't electrical interference," he muttered. "It's responding to us." A moment later, the camera lens fogged over as if exposed to sudden cold, despite the ambient temperature registering steady. As the fog cleared, the camera's feed displayed something none of them had seen before: a faint reflection on the smooth concrete. Not a physical reflection, but a distortion, like a shadow pressed from the inside trying to outline itself. The reflection shifted. Slowly. Deliberately. A vague humanoid shape formed beneath the surface of the wall, its outline bending unnaturally, as though the boundary between the room and the hallway wasn't entirely solid. The figure looked thin, elongated, with a crooked posture that made it appear unstable or unfinished. One investigator whispered, "It's the same shape from the tapes," but no one dared confirm it out loud. Trying to understand the physics behind the anomaly, the team placed a ground-penetrating scanner against the floor near the sealed wall. The device emitted high-frequency pulses, mapping the underground space. The reading returned a result that made the entire team step backward. A hollow chamber existed behind the wall, exactly where Ernest had drawn the room that wasn't there before. Worse, the chamber's dimensions didn't match the exterior building footprint. It extended deeper, farther, almost impossibly beyond the foundation, an architectural impossibility. The building shouldn't have had this space. It shouldn't have been able to support it. The scanner also detected movement inside the chamber. Small at first. Then larger. Something shifting, pacing, responding to the vibrations. One investigator suggested it might be an animal. Another reminded him that no animal could mimic human silhouettes in video footage. Suddenly, the concrete wall emitted a low, resonant vibration, like the deep sound of a bowed metal sheet. Dust fell from the ceiling. The lights flickered. The tapping resumed, louder this time. As if whatever was inside recognized the presence of people. Someone whispered shakily, "We shouldn't be here." But the lead investigator stepped forward, trying to calm the team. "We need to document everything. We don't open anything. We observe." Yet the building itself seemed unwilling to stay quiet. As they continued recording, the concrete surface pulsed twice, indented inward for a fraction of a second, before returning to normal. Like something inside pressed against the wall. Testing it. Searching for weak points. The thermal sensor now displayed an alarming shift. The heat signature inside the chamber moved closer to the wall, rising in intensity. The outline on the concrete sharpened slightly, its shape now unmistakably humanoid, but distorted, unfinished, as if it lacked some essential structure. And then came the whisper. Not loud. Not booming. But clear. A voice from behind the concrete. It said a single word, drawn out, strained, almost curious. Here, the temperature in the hallway dropped sharply. Investigators felt their breath condense in front of them. A heavy dread settled in the air as realization struck. Whatever had been mimicking shadows in the tapes, whatever had mirrored Ernest's voice, whatever had been watching people for decades, was behind that wall. The team retreated from the basement, shaken, arguing about whether to report the discovery or recommend immediate sealing of the chamber. But decisions were no longer theirs to make. The anomaly wasn't confined by architecture, blueprints, or physical limitations. It was aware. It was listening. And it had waited a long time for someone to step close enough to hear it. Ernest had warned them on his map. His notes had begged them to stay away. Yet here they stood, face to face with the room that shouldn't exist, the room where the building's darkest secret took shape, and the room that seemed disturbingly eager to meet them. The investigators reconvened in the viewing room with an unspoken heaviness. After witnessing the basement anomaly firsthand, their understanding of the tapes had changed. What they once viewed as eerie but ambiguous visual evidence now felt like a direct warning, one they had failed to comprehend soon enough. The 9th tape in the archived sequence was rumored to be the most disturbing, the one that left previous reviewers pale and silent. On its label, in smudged ink, was a single date and a single word written in shaky handwriting, "Don't." They watched it anyway. They had to. The footage began with Ernest entering the forbidden basement hallway, the same sealed corridor investigators had stood before hours earlier. But this scene wasn't handheld footage like the tape in his envelope. This was captured by a mounted security camera facing the entrance to the chamber that shouldn't exist. The timestamp on the screen matched the night Ernest vanished. At first, everything appeared normal. Ernest approached the camera from the right, flashlight in hand. He looked exhausted, shoulders slumped, as if he had been fighting sleep or fear for hours. His shadow stretched unnaturally long across the floor, bending in ways that didn't match his movements. The investigators exchanged uneasy glances but remained silent. Ernest stopped directly before the sealed door, back when it was still intact. He placed his ear against it, listening. For a moment, nothing happened. Then he whispered something too soft to catch on the microphone. The only audible sound was his breathing. Slow. Uneven. Unsteady. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered twice. Ernest stepped back, startled. The overhead light dimmed, then pulsed. With each pulse, the shadow beneath Ernest distorted further, thickening, thinning, elongating, shrinking. The shadow was not reacting to light. It was reacting independently. Then, without warning, the door shook violently. Ernest stumbled back, gripping his flashlight as if it were the only thing anchoring him to reality. The vibration through the wood was so intense that dust fell from the ceiling. The camera crackled with static, reacting to a surge of electromagnetic interference. And then, the door cracked open. Only a few inches. Only for a moment. But enough. A thin, crooked limb slid out through the narrow gap, a limb shaped like an arm but bent wrong, the elbow inverted, the wrist rotating too fluidly. The limb tapped gently against the floor in a familiar pattern, 3 slow taps, a pause, two faster ones. The investigators recoiled instinctively. One muttered, "My God, it's the same thing from the reflection." Ernest froze in terror. The taped footage showed him raising his flashlight toward the limb. The light struck the surface of the creature's skin, or what should have been skin. It reflected like something wet, semi-translucent, unfinished. The limb twitched in response to the light, retreating slightly before curling back toward Ernest like a grotesque beckoning gesture. He whispered, "No," and stepped back again. His voice cracked with fear. The door slammed shut with such force the camera shook. Ernest dropped his flashlight and it rolled across the floor, coming to a stop beneath the creature's lost reflection as it flickered faintly on the tiles. Then the screen cut to static. But this time, something moved within the static. A shape. A silhouette. Walking. When the picture returned, the hallway was dark except for the emergency light above the door. The camera's motion detector blinked red. Something had triggered it. Something now stood in the hallway, off frame. Slowly, the camera panned to the left on its own. The investigators watched in horrified silence. The camera had never moved autonomously before, yet here it was, turning as if following an invisible command. The view settled on a figure standing several feet from the camera. At first, it looked like Ernest. His height, his posture, even his breathing pattern matched. But Ernest was still visible on the far right side of the frame, huddled against the wall in terror. Two Ernests. One real. One imitation. The mimic stood perfectly still, head tilted slightly as though listening for instructions. Its face was blurred, features shifting subtly like clay still being shaped. Its arms hung too long, nearly down to its knees. But its stance was unmistakably Ernest's, down to the slight inward rotation of the right foot, a detail only someone deeply familiar with him would know. The real Ernest stared at his double, eyes wide with horror. He whispered, "It learned me." The mimic took one slow step forward. Then another. The lights flickered violently with each movement, plunging the hallway into stuttering frames of darkness. In one flash, the mimic appeared 10 feet away. In the next, it was 5 feet away. In the next, it stood inches from the camera, its distorted, wavering face pressed against the lens. The camera glitched. Lines tore across the screen. A high-pitched ringing filled the speakers. Ernest screamed something unintelligible, and the hallway erupted in overlapping shadows, the mimic's, and something else entirely. A mass of shifting darkness spread outward from the mimic's body, crawling like smoke along the floor and walls. Then the mimic turned its head toward Ernest. But its face, if it could be called a face, split along an invisible seam, stretching into a grotesque approximation of a smile. The lights blew out. The camera went fully black. Only audio remained. Scraping. Dragging. A distorted voice repeating Ernest's name over and over, each repetition less human than the last. Then, after nearly 20 seconds of darkness, the picture returned. The hallway was empty. Ernest was gone. The mimic was gone. The door to the chamber was now completely closed, its frame cracked. The only thing left was the flashlight, still rolling slightly from an unseen draft, and the faint sound of breathing somewhere just out of frame. The final seconds of the tape showed the camera slowly rotating back toward the stairwell. Footsteps echoed behind it, slow, deliberate, heavy. But nothing appeared. The footsteps continued until they sounded mere inches from the lens. Then the tape ended. No one in the viewing room spoke at first. They didn't need to. The footage confirmed every fear they had tried to suppress. The entity was not confined to the chamber. It could move freely. It could imitate freely. It had studied Ernest until it could become him. And the most terrifying implication of all, the final moment everyone was too afraid to voice, the tape ended not because the entity stopped moving. It ended because the entity walked out of frame, and kept going. The aftermath of the second tape viewing shook the investigative team to its core. What they had witnessed wasn't merely a disappearance, nor a haunting, nor some unexplained phenomenon that could be chalked up to environmental factors or malfunctioning equipment. It was intelligent. It was adaptive. And most terrifying of all, it was mobile. The realization that something had imitated Ernest so convincingly, then walked freely out of view, made one truth impossible to ignore: whatever the entity was, it could not be contained by walls or locked doors. This truth spread through the internal circles of municipal authorities with urgency and quiet panic. Within hours, emergency meetings were scheduled behind closed doors. Honored protocols were bypassed. Records were sealed. And any public official brave, or foolish, enough to ask questions was met with the same rehearsed answer: ongoing structural review. No further comment. But what happened behind those doors was far from routine. Officials reviewed the tapes again, this time with specialists present, experts in structural engineering, electromagnetic behavior, anomalous acoustic phenomena, and even psychological trauma. A few sections of footage were analyzed frame by frame, blown up, slowed down, sharpened, processed with modern enhancement algorithms. But no matter how advanced the tools, results remained the same: the mimic wasn't a camera glitch. It wasn't a projection. It wasn't a malfunction. It was a presence, something occupying physical space, yet unstable in form, as though it hadn't fully learned how to inhabit a human body. During these reviews, several specialists refused to continue. One engineer vomited after realizing the creature's limbs bent in ways that defied anatomy, yet moved with intention. Another expert left the room shaking, whispering that she heard it breathing through the static. But the most disturbing revelation didn't come from the tape. It came from internal logs cross-referencing building access data, emergency calls, and unfiled complaints. These records revealed something the public never knew: the building had been unofficially under observation for over 15 years. Officials had noticed anomalies long before Ernest vanished. Reports of unexplained noises, sudden electromagnetic spikes, and shadow-like figures observed by night workers were filed away discreetly. Maintenance workers claimed doors they locked one night were somehow open the next morning. Janitors described reflections that didn't match their movements. And yet, every time someone raised concern, the response was the same: don't escalate. Keep it internal. Authorities had been quietly monitoring the building, trying to determine whether something inside posed danger. But they never expected the danger would grow, evolve, or start mimicking the people trapped within. The night after the investigative team viewed the final tape, a secret emergency containment order was issued. Crews were dispatched in unmarked trucks. They arrived on site at dawn, moving with urgency but speaking to no one. The building was surrounded by barricades, the perimeter secured with temporary fencing. Local residents were told it was due to asbestos risk. But those who watched from their windows sensed something else: fear. Workers wearing heavy protective gear entered the building with equipment not typically used for demolition: thermal scanners, reinforced steel plating, industrial welding gear, and portable EMF dampeners meant for high interference zones. They weren't preparing the building for demolition. They were sealing it shut. One by one, the entrances were reinforced. Doors were welded shut. Windows were covered with thick steel sheets bolted directly into the frame. Vents were sealed. Basement access points were filled with concrete. The process was meticulous, urgent, and strangely silent, as if every worker feared that making too much noise might alert something inside. Inside the building, investigators left behind several motion sensor cameras to monitor whether the entity attempted to escape. These cameras were set to stream data live to a secure room in the municipal archives. For the first 2 hours, everything remained still: no movement, no interference, no signs of the entity. But then, as workers finished sealing the final door, the cameras detected motion in the basement corridor, the same one leading to the sealed chamber. A faint outline appeared on screen. Not fully formed. Not yet mimicking a person. But moving, slowly, deliberately, like a creature waking from hibernation. The EMF sensors spiked violently, and one camera feed cut out entirely. Another trembled with static as though something passed directly in front of the lens. The footsteps captured by the audio feed were soft but unmistakably bipedal. They traveled from the basement toward the stairwell. Every technician froze. The sealed doors meant nothing if the entity reached an unreinforced exit. Authorities ordered all workers to evacuate the building immediately. Some hesitated, glancing nervously at the walls as the sound of slow, heavy steps echoed through the hallways. One worker later reported hearing a voice call out from the darkness, his own voice, distorted and stretched, mimicking his tone with unsettling accuracy. He refused to return to the site after that. Minutes later, the final camera feed showed the stairwell door open slightly, not enough to reveal a figure, but enough to see shadow movement in the frame. And then, the feed cut out. All of them did. The official decision became unavoidable: the building had to be sealed, permanently and completely, before whatever was inside found a way out. But even as crews finished welding the final steel plate over the main entrance, fear lingered in every worker's eyes. Because no one could confirm one unthinkable question: had the entity already escaped? This fear intensified when officials discovered a final piece of evidence overlooked in initial reviews. A separate camera positioned outside the building, one meant to monitor the surrounding parking lot, captured footage the night Ernest vanished. The tape showed a figure leaving the building long before workers sealed it. At first, it appeared to be Ernest himself, same height, same posture, same walking gait. But the timestamp made that impossible. Ernest had already vanished before this figure emerged. In the grainy footage, the figure walked calmly into the darkness, heading toward the city streets. It never looked back. It never hesitated. But just before disappearing from view, the figure's head twitched unnaturally to the side, bending slightly too far, in a way no human neck could endure. That was the moment the officials realized: sealing the building wasn't about trapping something inside. It was about preventing people from going inside, and learning what had already walked out.